Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, yesterday I watched the brand new Netflix documentary, Nobody Speak, Trials of the Free Press. Now, I was really interested in watching this documentary for a couple of reasons. Number one, I enjoy documentary filmmaking. In fact, I would one day like to be in a position to be able to make my own documentaries. So I'm quite interested in the art of documentary filmmaking, particularly documentaries that are well made. Number two, the subject matter is something that interests me a lot. I'm passionate about media and journalism. I have been for many years now, engaged in actively training individuals and organisations in practical media skills and working alongside organisations and individuals to craft good media strategies. And I spent many years myself working as a media manager for an organisation, so as their spokesperson and crafting media strategy and working with journalists, etc. in that way. So it's something I'm passionate about. So I went into this documentary extremely interested. I came out of it really, really frustrated. This documentary isn't really a documentary. It's very much one-sided propaganda, and I think it actually, interestingly enough, it actually ends up highlighting some of the key problems that exist within the mainstream media today and why the mainstream media, by and large today, and with some notable exceptions, is currently experiencing a major crisis of credibility. And look, there's no doubt about it. They do have a credibility crisis. I know a lot of journalists don't like that fact. They don't like to be reminded of that fact. But if you step outside the media bubble, it's very clear that a lot of people have a very serious level of distrust in what the media is presenting to them. And this documentary, I think, really sort of highlights why. So first of all, it starts with the whole Gawker issue, the Gawker website. For those who don't know Gawker, go and Google it for yourself. But basically, Gawker was a pretty vile, tabloid, salacious scandal website, trying to parade itself as a news site. And the documentary starts by trying to make out that Gawker was some sort of pure, unfettered act of journalism. It really wasn't. I mean, even their own articles, and this is to me what I was talking about before when I talked about life inside the bubble. The people who made this documentary, I think, clearly live inside the bubble, and they don't realise what their own activities look like to the outside world, to the rest of us, because they are posting articles from Gawker to give examples of the work they do, and it's just really vile stuff. And it's clear that this is not journalism. I mean, you're really straining things to try and claim that this is journalism. But it starts with this whole Gawker case where Hulk Hogan, yes, I know that's not his real name, but for the sake of everyone understanding and for clarity on this little review, I'm going to keep calling him Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan took a court case against Gawker because they published a sex tape that he had been filmed being involved with, and they had published it on their website. And basically, Gawker effectively tried to make out that this court case was an assault on their First Amendment rights, their right to freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and the freedom of the press, etc., etc. It was nothing of the sort. Instead, the argument that was being made was that this was private. There was no public interest in this whatsoever, a celebrity sex tape, and that it was just salacious, and that what they did was just reprehensible, basically. And of course, Gawker lost the case. So they start by trying to paint Gawker as these legitimate journalists, and then they try and spin this big, convoluted plot about how this was an attempt to silence a free press. And straight away I thought, I bet you I know where they're going to try and take this. I bet anything they're going to try and take this documentary in the direction of suggesting this is all part of a big widespread conspiracy that's got something to do with Trump and some powerful billionaires and millionaires who want to try and control and dominate and shut down a free press. Now, the subject matter is interesting in and of itself, that whole issue of who controls the media. I think it's a really worthwhile subject matter for a documentary, and it really does deserve to be explored in detail. The problem is this documentary didn't do that, and not even in the slightest. It's very much a propaganda piece to try and justify really some of the problems that are going on in journalism, and effectively it almost comes across like it's trying to downplay them and put all the blame elsewhere instead of looking inside at the problems that exist within journalism. So from that point, there's a whole narrative they spin related to the Gawker court case about Peter Thiel, the millionaire from Silicon Valley. And they basically, look, the guy he's got some views and positions on things that people would consider quirky, but guess what? We all do. We all probably have views on things that other people would consider quirky and would disagree with. But basically what happened was Peter Thiel was funding Hulk Hogan's legal defence. And they tried to create this narrative that this was the sinister conspiracy plot, this big, rich, wealthy man who had crafted this whole outcome. It's absolute nonsense, though, because what Peter Thiel did was he saw Hulk Hogan's court case and he said, I agree with him because I myself have been the victim of some Gawker tabloid trash journalism. And so I think this guy has every right to defend himself and make the best possible case he can, so I'm going to fund his legal defence. And so he paid for his legal costs. And what happened was, though, that Hulk Hogan and his lawyers, they made their case, and the courts agreed with them. They won. They beat Gawker. They won. They were awarded millions of dollars in damages for what Gawker had done. But the way this documentary tries to spin it, you'd think that Peter Thiel had paid off the judge, had paid off the jury, was sitting there like some Machiavellian scoundrel with a whole array of video camera monitors in front of him watching the trial unfold and orchestrating this whole thing. That's not what happened. He did exactly what you're entitled to do in a free and open country. He saw a person who he thought had a worthwhile cause and who was taking that cause to court, and he decided to financially back that person. It happens all the time. It's totally normal and it's totally acceptable. And this is where the first of the sort of hypocrisies and ironies, I think, start to come into it. Because on the one hand, they talk about these attempts to sort of suppress and control the press and how that's a bad thing and their freedoms are being limited. But then they criticise Peter Thiel for exercising a basic freedom that he should be entitled to exercise, which is to choose how he spends his money and to support causes that he agrees with. And so it was straight away the contradictions are starting to come into it. Then it moves into the segment about the Las Vegas Review-Journal. And at that point, it started to feel like two different documentaries because there really isn't a strong tie-in with what happened with the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I'll talk about that in just a second, what it was exactly. But there's not a strong tie-in there. And anytime you're watching a documentary and you have to stop and think to yourself, hold on, what's the connection here? Why are we now telling this story? It suggests that your narrative is very weak and it's not strung together particularly well. And I would say this is a classic example of this because it then jumps into this whole thing about the Las Vegas Review-Journal. And the basic story in a nutshell is this, that the Las Vegas Review-Journal was sold to an organisation, a corporation that various wealthy people obviously had invested money in and had become the owners of the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I mean, this is common. This happens all the time. People who have got lots of money end up buying things. They have financial interests in things. And in this case, the financial interests happen to be in the ownership of this newspaper. And it sort of feels like two different documentaries because all of a sudden it's now on a completely different topic. What's interesting, though, is that I think this part of the documentary is really, really telling, and it begins to highlight some of the problems that I think exist within mainstream journalism today. First of all, and I was really surprised by this, they start that segment by talking about the day in which the announcement was made to all of the staff that the newspaper had been sold. And there's a representative, a manager, who turns up from this new financial corporation, this organisation which has bought the newspaper, the Las Vegas Review-Journal. And the journalist ask the man who bought, who was it that owns the company now, and he basically says, you don't need to know who the people are who own it. They just want you to keep doing your job. Now I'll come back to that in a second. But they start the segment by talking about that manager and that man who turned up to represent and who's a representative of the company which had bought the newspaper. And they literally start by insulting him. Not getting angry about what he said, not responding strongly or in harsh terms to what he was doing or what he was saying, but they literally start insulting him as a person. They talk about his weight. They effectively, well, they don't. They pretty much call him a fat, overweight slob. They literally compare him to Peter Griffin from Family Guy, and they even show some footage from Family Guy of Peter Griffin. And when that happened, I thought to myself, what an interesting insight, that the first thing these people thought to do was to actually insult and try and humiliate this man who has no way of defending himself. All we see is one photo of him. He's never interviewed. There's one unflattering photo shown of him. He's never interviewed on camera. He's never given an opportunity to put his side of the story. And all they're doing is they are literally, I would say it's a classic example of bullying, which is kind of interesting because the whole theme of the documentary is supposedly about the bullying of the media. But really, it's an interesting insight that they started there. From there, they move on, and this question is put to this manager: well, who owns the newspaper now? And to be fair, I'd be frustrated too if someone said to me, well, you don't need to know that, but all you do need to know is that they want you to carry on doing your job. Now, I'd be frustrated because when I ask a question, I like to have a straight answer. I don't like to be mucked around. I like to be told and told the truth, right? However, at that point, as a journalist, I would also think, okay, well, I've been told from the horse's mouth that they want me to just keep being a journalist. They're not interested in controlling me. They want me to keep doing my job. Isn't that a good outcome? Now, what's interesting is a couple of these journalists talk about the fact that this question was so important to them of who owned the company because they wanted to know whose interests they were now going to be serving. To me, that is a very telling and interesting question, because why would a journalist even need to ask that question? If someone's just told you, look, the owners want you to keep doing your job, and you think in your mind that your job is to be a good journalist who tells the truth and tries to do that in a fair way about important issues, why would you then need to ask the question, well, whose interests are we going to be serving? Doesn't that kind of suggest that these journalists actually view themselves as having to serve an interest? That their job as journalists is to serve an ideological interest? Well, that's a problem, isn't it? Because surely that's not the point of journalism. And it's not the first time we get that kind of issue crop up in this documentary. And I would say it was a very telling thing that they couldn't sort of have the two things exist in their mind or coexist in their mind. One, that they might be owned by a rich person or a group of rich people who had different politics to them, but at the same time, despite that, they could carry on with integrity and produce good quality, truth-telling and fair and balanced journalism about important issues. The fact that they were asking about who owned them as if that meant that they were now serving an interest, and that if they didn't like the ideology of the owners, they would go somewhere else where they liked the ideology of the owners. So it kind of suggests to me that their view of journalism is that they are meant to serve an ideology. And I would argue that's not what authentic journalism is supposed to be all about. At this part of the documentary, at one point there's a photograph shown of a group of people who wrote a story. And this is where the real hypocrisy and irony starts to come forth, because basically the whole point of the documentary is trying to claim that there is some sinister plot to take over journalism, and that these rich people buying up journalistic entities means that the press is now controlled in this way by these rich people, and that basically they are being bullied into submission and they can't tell the truth. Which is interesting, because in this documentary we're told that the first thing this group of journalists did who didn't like the new owners was they wanted to know more about who the new owners were. They went and did an investigative journalism investigation, and they found out who the owners were, and they wrote an article and they published it in their own newspaper. So the Las Vegas Review-Journal, which was owned now by these rich people, which supposedly are trying to suppress freedom of the press, actually allowed them to publish an article where they exposed who these anonymous owners were. Doesn't that clearly prove to you that these people who own your newspaper actually aren't trying to control you if they let you do that? If they wanted to control you, surely they would have actually shut that story down and stopped you from publishing it, but they didn't. There's another point at which we're showing a photograph of some of the people who are involved in that investigative journalist piece, and one of these journalists says, out of all these people, only one or two of them are left at the paper, the others have all left. And the implication, of course, is that they were pushed out, but it clearly actually seems like they all just chose to leave of their own volition. Right? And that's fair enough, I respect their integrity, but let's not try and overinflate this as if somehow they were bullied out or this was a tyrannical sort of overthrow and these people were ejected. It sounds like there's absolutely no case made that they were kicked out. Instead, it's, as I said, some of them stayed. It's clear, the clear indication is that these people decided it wasn't to their liking, so they left. So, it was all very overinflated, and the emotional overinflation of the documentary just gets really strained at some point. You had these sort of direct to camera, quotations and statements from people that are accompanied by this overly emotive and dramatic stock music. Clearly someone went to the stock music section, or sounds like stock music, or they went to a music producer and they said, we need some heroic music. Give us something that sounds like heroic military music, and we will play that in the background every time we talk about these journalists, or every time we talk about journalists, and this will stir your passions to think that these journalists are on the front lines and they're heroic warriors in the culture war sort of thing. And it's very much crafted. The whole tone of it's crafted in that way, but it gets a bit repetitive. It is overinflated. It really is. Then there's another point at which they, towards the end of the documentary, sure enough, as I predicted, they try and tie this all to Donald Trump. And they have this ominous music, which is basically, it's stock music. It sounds like stock music. It sounds like it is a piece of stock music that was clearly modelled on composer John Murphy's musical score for the zombie film 28 Days Later. Great film, great score. There's a very good piece called In the House in a Heartbeat. And a lot of people have replicated it in movies and in stock footage all over the place. And this is very much one of those, the sort of strong, ominous piano beat with then you bring in the strings, and you have this sort of strong, ominous building thing. And that's very much what they have playing in the background as they talk about Donald Trump, and they try and create this idea that this is all part of some big, vast conspiracy, and Donald Trump and a couple of rich people are now trying to destroy the press, and that's what's going wrong for journalism today. But here's the thing. Here's the big problem with this documentary. At the end of the day, it tries and it completely fails to suggest that the current crisis of credibility that exists in the mainstream media is all the fault of Donald Trump and a couple of rich tyrants. That's really what this documentary is trying to suggest. But what they don't get is that in actual fact, a lot of people were cheering Donald Trump on, or even those who didn't necessarily want him to be elected, like a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters I know, were quietly nodding in agreement when Donald Trump called out the problems in the mainstream media, and he stood up to them. And the thing that Trump did was it lacked virtue, it was ugly, it was brutal in places, and it's still going on. But what Trump has done is he's just stood up to the media, and he's just stood his ground, and he's basically said, I'm not going to be kowtowed by you. Now, you don't have to like Trump to see that that's probably not a bad thing. That just like having politicians who get out of control and who become authoritarian and exercise too much unaccountable power, the same thing is true of the mainstream modern media. It very much, I think, had got itself into a position of it just wielded too much influence, and there was so many blurred boundaries, and it had gone from a lot of people were no longer engaging in journalism, they were engaging in activism and cloaking it under journalism. And so there was too much power being wielded, and it was an unhealthy thing. And so along comes Donald Trump, and he makes himself immune to it by just refusing to buy in. And it was ugly, it was brutal, it lacked virtue, there's things he said that I would never say, I never agree with, but the point was the media don't like it. And all of a sudden it was a shock to a lot of journalists, I think, that someone would just stand their ground against them. And I think what they don't seem to realise is that a lot of people, as I said, were cheering that aspect of Donald Trump's campaign on, and a lot of people were quietly nodding in agreement. Even if they didn't like Trump, they were sort of going, yeah, well, good on him for standing up to the media, or at least someone standing up to the media. And they probably inside were wishing it was Bernie or someone else who was doing it, who was more to their particular tastes. But I think most people out there know that there's a problem. There is a problem. And this documentary really is a classic example of some people inside a bubble, the media bubble in this case, who are producing a documentary that really is tailored for the rest of the people inside the bubble. Because all of us on the outside can see what they appear to be incapable of understanding. We're not fooled by any of this. We're looking at this documentary and we're going, no, you can't blame Hulk Hogan and Peter Thiel and Donald Trump. They've got their own faults, but you can't blame them for the crisis of credibility that the media is currently experiencing. The problem is we don't trust the mainstream media anymore because so many times the mainstream media has let us down. And I think this is interesting. For me, it's what really this documentary highlights is how mainstream journalism now has really, it's like Watergate has come full circle. Watergate was when the journalism pursued corrupt politicians and they exposed corrupt politicians, and the highest office in the land, the President of the United States, was exposed as being embroiled in some very serious corruption. And so what happened was it shattered the myth, it shattered the bubble, it shattered this sort of mythology about politicians and the presidency being this sort of unimpeachable, untouchable sort of bastion of virtue and good. I mean, we'd all known that politicians had their quirks and foibles before that, but all of a sudden it was exposed in a very raw and brutal way that, that it was almost like previously there was a gentleman's agreement. You would fight hard in politics, But what happened here was that the dirty nature of it was really exposed. And so it was, for a lot of people of that generation, the Nixon era, a lot of people lost faith and lost their trust in politics and politicians, and it started a sort of cycle of not trusting politicians. Well, what's happening now, I think, is this is like a Watergate moment for journalism. And what's happening now is, because of Trump, he didn't do it on purpose, and he's not a righteous crusader at all. It's just because he didn't kowtow, and it's through, as I said, it's an accident that it's happened, but it has. What's happened is he has shattered the perception of trust in the media, and I think he's made a lot of people realise, or he's really brought to the surface, he's lanced this boil. He's like this guy who walked into a doctor's waiting room and there's a patient sitting there with a very painful boil that needed to be lanced. And Donald Trump stumbled in. He's not a doctor. He stumbles in. He accidentally trips over, and in his hand is one of the surgical implements as he grabs as he's sort of falling over off the desk. And as he falls, he ends up lancing the boil on the leg of this patient. And it was brutal, and it wasn't surgical, and it wasn't intended, but it needed to happen. Right? And that's what Donald Trump has done with the whole current media credibility crisis. He's lanced the boil. Now it needs to be cleansed and have antiseptic put on it. It needs to find a new way. And so it's like this Watergate moment where all of a sudden now journalism's come full circle, and it's no longer the politicians that people are not trusting. It's media now that people can see has a very serious credibility crisis. And what makes this documentary even more laughable is when you think about, because they're trying to claim that journalism is the serious endeavour, and I think it should be. But the problem is when you look at what's going on in the United States media at the moment, with so many absurd Russian conspiracy theories being propagated, and now they're all starting to die off because they lacked any basis in reality. It was just absurd stuff. And when you saw months and months of this absurd Russian conspiracy theory stuff being propagated actively by the media, it's pretty hard to take their claims seriously in this documentary that they are hard done by and that they're trying to fight the fight of good, and they're being suppressed, etc., etc. You really realise that in actual fact, there's some big problems within journalism, and they're not willing to face them. There's something really interesting in the final summary of this documentary where a couple of journalists say some interesting things. One of them says, basically, if you're not aggravating a billionaire, then you're not doing your job right as a journalist. And another one says, our job is to afflict the comfortable and to comfort the afflicted. Now, that's interesting to me because I think, yes, those things will happen often if you're doing good journalism. But that's not why, and that's not the core mission of journalism. The core mission of journalism is not to aggravate billionaires. The core mission of journalism is not to afflict the comfortable. The core mission, I would argue, of journalism is to tell the truth about important issues. To tell the truth about important issues. And you tell the truth by presenting the facts and by being fair, by presenting all sides, by not prejudicing one side over the other, by telling the truth and focusing on important issues. And that should be the primary mission of journalism. And in doing that, there will be moments when you might aggravate billionaires or you might afflict the comfortable. But if your whole focus is a very subtle difference, but if your focus is, well, my job is to aggravate comfortable people and my job is to go after billionaires, then really what you're saying is I'm actually supposed to be an activist. Or I'm supposed to be some sort of social change agent. My job is to change society. And effectively what they're implying is that their job is to be involved in some sort of Marxist class struggle against the bourgeoisie. My job as a journalist is to fight for the proletariat against the people who have the money. It's just Marxism. It's not really journalism at that point. As I said, authentic journalism should start with this idea, my calling, my job is to tell the truth about things that matter. It's to present facts and to be fair and balanced in the way I present them about issues that matter. And a Hulk Hogan sex tape is not an issue that matters, right? And the way Gawker conducted itself was simply not fair or balanced. It was really quite vile, the way they conducted themselves. And I agree with the final statement of this documentary that without good, strong journalism, you don't have a healthy democracy. I've been saying this for a long time. That's why I'm so concerned about the media crisis, because it has a very real impact upon healthy democracy and healthy society. We need the fourth estate to stop acting like a rundown housing estate and actually do its job properly. At the moment, the fourth estate is acting, as I said, like a housing estate, and it just simply sells itself to the highest ideological bidder, and it's a real problem. But this raises an interesting question. If they truly do believe that an unhealthy democracy can be caused by serious crisis within media itself, then what does that say about the current state of America? Because I think, to be fair, there are some big questions about the health of American democracy right now. And those questions have existed before Trump for many, many years. You don't get a Donald Trump unless your democracy is not in a particularly healthy place. And if people were happy and they thought things were good and well within their society, they wouldn't vote for a Donald Trump. They vote for a Donald Trump because they are sick and tired of what's going on and they're looking for a way out. And Donald Trump, they thought, was their way out. So if your democracy is not healthy and you believe journalism can cause unhealthy democracies, what does that say about the current state of mainstream journalism, particularly in America? Doesn't it suggest that perhaps it's got a crisis and it's actually leading to the current unhealthy democracy, and that journalism itself is responsible? See, perhaps the big question, and they never explore this in the documentary, and I think they really should have, is that perhaps the real question here is that the threat and the dysfunction for journalism is not an external threat, but in actual fact, it's mainly internal. It's actually the very culture of mainstream media journalism now has basically become the crisis because the culture is unhealthy within journalism. And when you have a documentary which essentially starts by trying to equate Gawker with good journalism, and it tries to suggest that they're a bastion of what authentic journalism, or that they're part of the stable of what authentic journalism is all about, and that you should be protecting the kind of stuff that they are engaging in and defending it, then I would say that that documentary is actually evidence that there is a crisis, a problem, a very serious crisis within media culture right now, and that the big problem for them is internal, it's not external. And that the real threat comes from the fact that media culture, mainstream media culture, has actually stopped telling the truth about things that matter. That they are now more often than not, engaged in activism. They see themselves as having to defend the Republic against some evil Hitler-type character, right? They effectively do that in this documentary, all but call him Hitler. They really get close at one point. And what it shows is that these journalists, I think, have lost an important aspect of good journalistic ethics, good journalistic practice. They have lost objectivity. They have lost their ability to take a step back and say, I'm just going to tell the truth. Instead, what they're doing is they are now looking for facts and information, no matter how nefarious and circumstantial it might be, to try and suit a narrative, to try and suit an ideology, and then they will print and publish and broadcast that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.